Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Art Business Podcast. My name is Dr. David Bellingham. I'm Programme Director of the Master's degree in Art Business at Sotheby's Institute of Art in London. And my guest today is an alumna of that very programme. She studied the MA in 2016-17. Welcome, Laura Pei.
Thank you, David, for having me.
You're very welcome. And the reason that I've asked Laura to be my honoured guest this week is because we're right. I think I'm right in saying, Laura, we're right in the middle of the Singapore Art Week. And Laura, you'll be able to read her bio. I think if I remember rightly, you were born in Hong Kong, but ended up really very much operating out of Singapore, Laura.
Yes, I'm Singaporean, but I was born in Hong Kong.
That's it.
And actually spent quite a lot of time outside of Singapore as well.
Just bear with me a second. I'm just going to switch off my emails. Otherwise, the listeners will be hearing notifications all the time. So they're switched off now. No, exactly. So Laura is a really good person. She's very much, as hope you'll see, she's very much immersed in the Singapore art scene. I don't know about any of the listeners whether they've been to Singapore. We used to actually have a branch of Sotheby's Institute in Singapore about 10 to 15 years ago. I think it lasted about 4 or 5 years, and I used to go out there for these intensive weeks of. I think we were teaching the MA Art Business. And just a couple of things about that, because it might interest the listeners, about the slightly different educational models in Southeast Asia. It was very normal for people to fly in from all over Southeast Asia, as far away as India, as far away as the USA. They chose to come to Singapore, which was really nice for Singapore. And we teach them intensively for a week. And I was teaching ethics in the art market. And then they would they'd go away for another 4 weeks, I think, and write their assignment, and then I'd grade it and so on. But sadly, for reasons I won't go into now, that institute closed down. But I think there's been a lot of changes since I was there, which we will no doubt talk about, in the course of the recording. Anyway, enough of that. I'm just going to start, Laura, as ever, by just asking if you can tell us about your favourite city, if you have one.
Yeah, actually, I think my favorite city changes all the time, but at the moment, I would say it's Bangkok. Yeah, so Bangkok is really I would say the heart of Southeast Asia, and it's a really great place for contemporary art. The people are so warm and friendly, and yeah, and I think it's just such a great place to be and to see things, and I think everything, you just feel the energy there, and everything is so vibrant.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't know Bangkok other than mythologically. I think most people will have heard of Bangkok, probably as somewhere, from a traditional Western viewpoint, as somewhere exotic, and where you go and where you can have a lot of fun. But maybe there are other aspects about that, because I think the image that the West has of Bangkok is as a pleasure place. Am I wrong?
No, I don't think you're wrong. Yeah, but I think that's a lot about the Western perception of Asia. Is that it's always very exotic, and maybe it's just because the culture is so different from what you see and experience in the West. Yeah, which is why I always encourage people to come to Asia by themselves and discover Asia for what it is.
Absolutely, yeah. And obviously the feedback is always positive, and I think culturally you hear a lot of good things about all of these places, obviously, including, of course, Singapore, which well, during the course of the conversation, I can say now that I loved particularly the public museum scene in Singapore. They've got the most amazing museums and most amazing architecture, but we can talk about that later. So do you have a kind of a non-urban location that you particularly love?
Non-urban location,
like countryside or beach?
I am more of a mountains person.
Mm.
Yeah, so I love like the Alps, just being in the snow, I think, because it's just so it really feels like a retreat. Like where it's, it's just everything is just white and it's so quiet and you're just, skiing by yourself. Yeah, so I really like kind of like snowy mountain resorts.
That's it. So you would go skiing rather than hiking. What we in the UK call walking in the mountains.
Yeah, I prefer skiing to hiking
Yeah.
or beach.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it's the first time anyone has ever spoken about the mountains, and you're quite right. It's a lovely place to escape because just that pure whiteness of the
Mhm.
landscape is just a great metaphor for what we should be doing when we're on vacation, i.e., like a bit of mindfulness, like emptying our minds. I totally agree. I love the snow. We don't see enough of it in London, of course. Um,
Yeah.
and of course, Singapore would never see snow because, if I remember rightly, it's right on the equator, pretty much.
Yeah, so we never have snow and it's tropical, humid, sunny all year round.
I remember that I had to wear like two. I took all linen shirts, and I used to have to kind of change. I used to wear like two a day because of the humidity in Singapore. Any listeners
Yeah.
who've been there will know that. I mean, and it's lovely. I mean, you get used to it very quickly, and it's good for someone like me who's quite speedy naturally because it just slows me down. I love that. And what about architecture? I mean, I remember in Singapore, obviously to me, it was the first Asian city I've been to. In fact, it's the only Asian city I've been to. Forgive me. And
Oh,
that isn't
okay.
that. Yeah, no, that isn't because of not wanting to go. It's literally just the usual time and where else I have to go on vacation and work for work and so on. But it's literally the only Asian city I've been to. But I do remember one of the things was some obviously there's a lot of British imperialist um,
Mhm.
architecture there, like neoclassical. But there were these wonderful temples that are part of obviously Asian religion. But what would you say is your favorite building?
I think Singapore's architecture is a mix of colonial style buildings, and also contemporary architecture,
Sure.
which is like, Marina Bay Sands, you see all of that very fancy architecture. In terms of, I quite like the colonial buildings because I feel like it's not what you really see in the world today. And in
Mhm.
Singapore, they're exceptionally well preserved.
Yes, yes. And
Yeah, so we do have like kind of English colonial style buildings, but also what we call Peranakan, which is uh what was left over when Singapore became independent from Malaya. Yeah, so it's like Malay style, kind of like pastel buildings.
yeah, I mean, and you've already hit on something that is very noticeable in Singapore. It's very like London in some ways, i.e., the demographics of being very
Mhm.
multicultural. Obviously, more multicultural in terms of like Asian populations from different nations, including China and Malaysia
Mhm.
and Indonesia. I remember there's a lot of people from those nations, and that I mean, just for listeners, that it makes it a very comfortable place, I would say, to go and visit if you are a Londoner or used to a city like London. I would say I remember one of the contemporary buildings actually, which was the concert hall.
Mhm.
Which I think locals jokingly compared to one of those
Durians.
yeah, those stinky fruits that are actually
Yeah.
really nice once you peel them. It's like a big green hedgehog on the side of the river, if I remember rightly. But
Yeah,
beautiful,
I think yeah, that's quite a landmark in Singapore.
absolutely. And that reminds me, actually, listeners might be interested in knowing that Laura is actually a very accomplished musician. I think you play the cello and have played solo cello in concerts.
I play the harp.
It's the harp. Oh goodness, apologies. Yeah, it's the harp, which is amazing. I mean, a very unusual instrument, very difficult one to carry around.
Yeah, definitely.
And are you still playing, professionally or semi-professionally?
Professionally, I play sometimes, but not too often
Hmm.
nowadays because I'm focusing more on my publishing house.
which we can talk about later as well.
Mhm.
So I guess that brings us on to the next question. If you were a harpist, do you have a favorite piece of music? If you could only take one piece of music to a desert island with your harp, what might it be?
If I could take one piece of music, I think it would definitely be something contemporary.
Hmm.
Yeah, contemporary with like, using lots of different techniques that the harp has. Just because I feel like I could never get bored.
Absolutely. And do you
Yeah.
have a particular composer in mind, or just challenging music that is written for harp? Is there quite a lot of music written for harp by contemporary composers?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of music. I mean, the development of the harp really started in the early 1900s in France. And then from there it just took off. So yeah, so today there's a lot of contemporary music being written for harp.
Yeah, beautiful instrument. Of course, there are harps and harps. There's in the UK we've got like a lot of former Celtic culture and folk music is using like the Irish harp, and that could be very. And I think in Brittany and France there's a lot of like contemporary folk musicians from France and the UK in particular. I think that actually sing accompanied by the harp.
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah, it's difficult instrument, I'm sure, to play. And then finally, again, a really difficult question. I hate it when people ask me these questions about favorites because it depends on your mood. But again, if you could take one work of art for that desert island, what might it be? Even reluctantly leaving others behind.
If I could take one work of art,
Contemporary
I
again?
I yeah, it would be contemporary, but I kind of feel like it would be a piece of art that I currently have.
Mm.
Yeah. So there's this artist called Balinese artist, so Indonesian artist called Citra Sasmita.
Hmm.
And her work is really based on um it's I mean her stories are derived from traditional Balinese mythology, but she kind of uses the female as a figure of empowerment. Yeah, because women were always seen as kind of like second class in Bali, and they don't have the same rights as men. Um, and so the stories that she uses are really inspired by, folklore and folk tales, but she integrates like female figures and different kinds of animals into her stories, like her canvas works, to kind of create a new kind of storyline.
Sounds very topical. It sounds amazing. I think that if you could send me a link for the artist, and then I'll
Mhm.
share it with the listeners to look at this artist's work. Sounds amazing. I've actually in the 1980s, a long time ago, I actually wrote a book on Celtic mythology, but one on Greek mythology, and then the publishers said, "Oh, this was well received. Could you do another one in our series?" And I leapt at the idea of doing Celtic mythology from my own nation because our stories have got forgotten, as many myths have got forgotten in contemporary culture. So I love mythology. Levi Strauss, the structural anthropologist, the French structural anthropologist, he one of my favorite quotes from him is, "Myths are good to think with." You can do anything you like with myth, and it's fluid, it changes. Different generations can slightly change the story to adapt to their own culture, but the underlying structures, as Levi Strauss pointed out, remain very similar. It's the surface narrative that can change.
Yeah, and I think like it's reinterpreted by every generation
Yeah,
as
and
well.
now, of course, the feminist looking at the women in mythology, who are often, like in Greek mythology, often very, very powerful figures when we revisit that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So moving to Singapore, I'm aware that a lot of my listeners, may not have been to Singapore. Maybe you could start, Laura, just by giving us a very, very brief, maybe even the history from the last century, just very briefly, because I think that affects the art and cultural world in Singapore. Maybe say something along the way about its demographics and its politics.
Yeah, so Singapore is a very young country. So we are 50, it's only been 59 years since our independence. But let me go back to the earlier colonial years. So Singapore has always been a trading port between the East and West due to our strategic location between Malaysia and Indonesia. So for a long time, it was part of the Malay archipelago. And in 1819, a British man called Stamford Raffles came to Malaya and signed a treaty with the two members of the royal family of Johor. And that gave the British East India Company the right to set up a trading post in Singapore. And so the British were in Singapore for a total of 144 years until 1963, when Singapore officially became a state in Malaysia. And of course, in between, World War II happened, and that's when Singapore was occupied by the Japanese between 1942 and 1945. And after the Japanese occupation, the trust in the British really declined. And that's when the British thought, okay, we need to start giving Singapore a bit more self-governance. And that happened until 1963, when we merged with Malaya. And then 2 years later, we separated and became an independent nation in 1965. And that's when the modern Singapore really began. And I would say the success can really be credited to one person called Lee Kuan Yew, who's considered the founding father of Singapore and was our prime minister for 31 years. And because he knew that Singapore is a city of immigrants with many people of different ethnicities, such as Malays, Indians, Eurasians, and actually quite a lot of Jewish people at that time, who arrived in Singapore during the colonial years. And actually, since the 1860s, and I think a lot of people don't know this, is that Singapore has always been majority Chinese. And due to the British, this is due to the British investment in labor-intensive industries, such as rubber and tin. And so many Chinese immigrants moved here from mainland China to work in labor-intensive industries such as agriculture, construction, shipping, and mining before starting their own very successful businesses after they had stayed for a few more years. And because Lee Kuan Yew knew that this multiculturalism was extremely important to develop Singapore to become a very prosperous nation, he promoted multiracial societies and also English as the lingua franca in order to integrate all the immigrants. And actually, Singapore is the only country in Asia to have English as the primary spoken and written language.
Yeah, and of course that is moving on to Singapore Art Week and Singapore as a cultural art location. That is something that's going for it. I think in the financial world, I remember when I was there at lunchtime walking along the river, and there are all these big, financial buildings, and I couldn't believe how many like London accents I heard with these businessmen, mainly businessmen and women, having lunch along the river. It was and I think the English thing is one of its big strengths, were it to position itself more strongly within the international art world. But before we come to that, I just wanted to apologize for laughing when you mentioned Raffles, but I do remember going to this very touristy, maybe that's the wrong word, like colonial historical bar called Raffles. Is it a hotel or a bar in Singapore?
Yeah, it's called the Raffles Hotel.
The Raffles Hotel.
And then they have a very famous bar there.
That's right, very famous bar, and I think a lot of cultural tourists will go there once. And I remember one of the terrible customs that persist there. I don't know if it's still happening. Is that you get peanuts with your beer or wine or cocktail, and in their husks, and you throw the husks on the ground, and then a waiter comes up and sweeps them up. Is that still happening?
It is. Yeah, so there's a tradition of the bar, and so when you go in, you still see peanut husks all over.
Yeah, and I remember thinking that it's it not only was it an experience of the the romance of colonial, the positives of colonialism, if you like. But it was also reminded me how appalling colonialism could be in terms of class systems and so on, that some other person, that we could just throw these things on the floor and someone else comes and picks them up, So that was a very interesting experience for me to understand my own nation's, that my own nation's, the positives and negatives of imperialism out of the UK. But as you say, at the same time, those colonial buildings are really quite beautiful in their own way, although they signify less beautiful things, perhaps. There's a cricket. I remember them playing cricket. England at this very moment, or in India, another of the big colonies, playing cricket. It feels very, very kind of English in many ways. But coming back to the art, maybe I could start this conversation. From my point of view, I remember going to there were contemporary art museums that were really, really astonishingly cutting edge, mainly showing like Southeast Asian artists, like Chinese contemporary artists. This was before the financial crash of 2008, when Chinese contemporary artists were getting really well known internationally. I was seeing some amazing exhibitions there. But I remember the modern museum. It was interesting the way it was arranged, because it contained modernist art, often learnt from the West. Like a lot of these artists had emigrated to Paris and so on, bringing back Parisian modernist ideas or using them in their own art. But they were from all over those nations we've already spoken about, not just from Singapore. They're from Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on. So maybe you could just say something from your point of view about the history of art in Singapore, maybe from the modern period to the present day, before we start talking about the Art Week.
Yeah, definitely. I think the most important period for the development of art in Singapore would be in the 1920s and 30s, where, like you said, a lot of artists emigrated to Singapore from places like London and Paris, and they brought back the techniques that they had learned in the West. And we call artists from this period, the Nanyang School. So this includes artists like, Georgette Chen, Liu Kang, Chen Wenxi, and all of their works can be found in our National Gallery today. And this period is also when the first art school in Singapore, the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, was founded in 1938. Yeah, so this East and West merge of traditions continued through the 1970s, especially with Chinese ink, where artists schooled in traditional Chinese calligraphy and ink painting also went abroad to study and brought back Western techniques with the traditions of Chinese ink. And it was only until the 1970s, and I think this is in tandem with the global development of contemporary art, that contemporary art started emerging in Singapore, but particularly in performance and conceptual art. And also, so this is also when the second tertiary arts institution, the LaSalle College of Art, was formed, and then followed about 20 years later with the School of Art, Media and Design at the Nanyang Technological University, which they're actually very, very strong in research and new media practices. And yeah, I think in terms of like the auction houses, also after the 1970s, in 1985, Sotheby's was the first auction house to set up an office in Singapore, and 5 years later was followed by Christie's. And today, Phillips and Bonhams also have a representative, but they don't have like an official office. And we also have a handful of smaller auction houses, 33 Auction and 2 from Indonesia called Masterpiece and Larrazati. But you're also right in a sense that all of the art that we see sold at these auction houses and also in Southeast Asian sales in Hong Kong, they're still very much modern Southeast Asian art or traditional Chinese ink painting and calligraphy. Yeah, and I think for major institutions, we have 3 government-owned institutions. The Singapore Art Museum, which was established only in 1995, which is quite late, and that focuses on contemporary art. The Singapore Tyler Print Institute in 2002, which specializes in printmaking and paper-based techniques. And then finally, the National Gallery, which opened in 2015, which has the largest holdings of Southeast Asian art in the world. Yeah, and another major museum, which is actually privately owned by an American company, is the Art Science Museum, which is part of Marina Bay Sands. And that's focusing on science and technology, and is owned by Las Vegas Sands Corporation.
Yeah, I remember when I was there. Am I right in saying that the Marina Bay Sands was still being developed, like in the early new millennium? I don't think
Yeah,
it had been
it was
completed.
still being built. Yes.
Yeah, so that, I think things must have changed a lot. I mean, my experience of the art world when I was there. So, you know, obviously I had these MA Art Business students, and you know, I was trying to also do maybe some visits to see the Singapore art scene. At that time, I remember it was quite disappointing that there wasn't, you know, it's not like when you're in London or Manhattan or Paris where there are kind of like commercial art galleries everywhere selling art. It was quite at that time, it was quite a small part of the town where almost like I seem to remember even like a block, rather than a kind of district where there are a lot of different galleries selling different kinds of art. And the other thing I remember from that time, you know, early years of the millennium, but this was very interesting to me when I began to realize that this was a free port and what free port means for the art world. But the free port then, and maybe it's still true today, isn't in the city. You have to go out to the dock area and warehouses. And I remember that they used to have these amazing shows of very well-known contemporary artists, for example, in the warehouses on the side of the docks, because that was legally part of the free port still. So American dealers would actually literally fly or, you know, bring works of art in, and they'd do an exhibition in the docks, so that Southeast, presumably not just Singaporean collectors, but people from all over Southeast Asia would come there to buy the work. So you had that kind of art market going on in as part of the free port, but not within the city. And then within the city, it had fantastic public galleries that you've just described, but the actual commercial art side wasn't developed then. I don't know, you know, maybe that you could now say a little bit about the topography of the art world at the moment in Singapore.
Yeah, so Singapore actually, I think due to how Singapore has developed since independence, it's a very highly structured government-run kind of I would say almost like an organization, kind of like, you know, a CEO planning the long-term development of the organization. And that's very much how Singapore is run. It's very conformist, and it's also very conservative. And I think the issue with art in Singapore is that it's very broad, and it's the government is always trying to appeal to the masses. Like, you know, art is for everyone, which works in certain aspects, but doesn't work in certain aspects, like for commercial galleries, which is, you know, it's a business of selling art of a certain price point, which is not available to everyone. So in Singapore, art is usually viewed as one of the following. The first is as entertainment, which is, for example, you know, graffiti street art murals or immersive experiences like TeamLab. The second is as a traditional craft, like weaving or calligraphy, where the focus is really on preserving a technique, a heritage, or a culture. The third is as a luxury good or commodity, so similar to high-end fashion, or investments, or, you know, just buying something to decorate your house. And the fourth is contemporary art, which is what we find in museums, biennials, and some galleries around the world. But contemporary art, I think, is really about challenging traditional concepts and making us question, which is a big problem for the development of contemporary art in Singapore, because it is in the DNA of the citizens and of the people and of the country to be conformist and to be conservative in our daily habits, our way of living, and how we think. Because contemporary arts requires some kind of chaos, but Singapore doesn't have any chaos because we are like a picture perfect country with like lots of rules, and we can't even do a public protest without a license here. Others we get thrown in jail. And state censorship is also a very big thing, like on themes of politics, religion, race, and sex, and that inhibits a lot of artists from risk taking, and also discourages the production and development of contemporary art. And this is why a lot of very strong Singaporean artists actually establish their careers outside of Singapore, and they go on to have very successful careers in places like New York, London, and Berlin. And in some sense, this also relates to the collectors that we have in Singapore and the collecting habits. Because if collectors here only see art that is entertaining, traditional, or decorative, it'll be very difficult to develop a good collector base in an organic manner. And this is regardless of the amount of funds that the government would invest in the arts. And they have really invested a lot. So Singapore, the way they do the city planning is always how it can contribute to making Singapore a very attractive place for people to invest in, of people to move to. And so the government over the past 20 years has developed this thing called the Renaissance City Plan, which is now called the Singapore Arts Plan. So it was reviewed every 4 years. Now it's every 5 years. But that's when they started so it started in 2004, and the Singapore Biennial began in 2006. And that's organized by Singapore Art Museum. So that's once every 2 years, and it's still going on. And then the contemporary galleries district called Gillman Barracks, started in 2012. And actually, it was a big failure, considered a big failure in the art world. Because, there were several things that could have contributed to the failure, such as, poor planning, or, making a lot of promises, but not delivering on them. It still exists today. And there are I would say about 8 to 10 galleries in Gillman Barracks. And so actually we do have an Art Galleries Association of Singapore, and there are 24 members in the association. But I would say only about 12 of them are considered like internationally active galleries. And out of those 12, only 2 are Singaporean owned. Yeah, so actually a lot of foreign galleries like Shang Art from Shanghai, Ota Fine Art from Japan, Sundaram Tagore from America, they all have locations in Singapore, but only 2 galleries are actually owned by Singaporeans.
You've been thank you for being very open about and critical in some ways about the production and consumption of art in Singapore being quite conservative. This is something that you hear and that I witnessed when I was there as well. I remember being invited to an opening, private view, lovely hotel lobby, and I remember thinking, this, I don't like this. This art is pretty, but it's not what I would consider, good contemporary art. And I think you've hit the nail on the head by saying that it's kind of almost encouraged by the system that the art remains fairly decorative and pretty and not challenging, if you like, to philosophies and politics and so on. So I can understand why frustrated contemporary Singaporean artists might form a diaspora of Singaporeans in the outside of Singapore. But then those commercial galleries you're talking about, well, with the 24 members of the guild, if I can call it that, do any of them specialize? You said that some of them specialize in international art, but do any of them specialize in what we would recognize as internationally interesting contemporary art, the kind of art that might appear in MoMA or Pompidou Centre or Tate Modern, if you understand what I'm getting at? Good.
Yes, so there are about 12 of them
Yes.
who do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean who, participate in the major art fairs like Frieze Art Basel.
Sure.
Yeah, so about 12 of them, and they maybe have like about four or between 4 to 6 shows per year in Singapore.
Yes. Oh, that's
Yeah.
good. So at least that is a seed that is growing within Singapore. Because as I understand it, there's particularly recent years, I think, haven't quite a lot of Chinese ultra high net worth individuals moved to Singapore. So you've got suddenly this influx of people with a lot of money who are probably going to eventually want to signify that wealth by collecting art. But what kind of art? What is their taste? So let's just take the Chinese. Is it every kind of taste, or do they have a particular specific kind of taste?
Yeah, actually, in terms of, the galleries in Singapore, they don't, a
Mm.
lot of them don't make their, they don't really sell much to Singaporeans, to
Yeah.
locals, but they just use Singapore as a base for
Yes.
either for Asia or Southeast Asia because,
Yes.
it's very quite easy to do business here.
Yeah.
And like, 10 years, many of them have been here for like 10 years. And of course, now it's extremely expensive, the real estate, but 10 years ago, it wasn't so expensive.
Sure. But
Yeah,
are there tax reasons with the free port environment that also make it a suitable location for those galleries, or not?
I think it's more of because Singapore is the most developed economy in Southeast Asia.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so it makes sense to have, if they happen to have a lot of Southeast Asian clients
Yeah.
to have the gallery or showroom in Singapore.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway,
because like, yeah, historically a lot of like wealthier Southeast Asians um have homes in Singapore.
brilliant, brilliant. But generally
Yeah.
speaking, we could say that generally within Singapore, it's those any art collectors are going to be relatively conservative in their tastes, but there may be some exceptions, and that quite Singapore, as we've already said, is quite a multicultural place. So there may also be people going into those galleries and buying art who are like wealthy people just working in the financial district there, but basically from the UK, from America, and
Mm.
so on. So
Yeah, and
yeah.
Singapore is one of the most expensive cities in the world,
Mm.
and the top 10 cities with the most billionaires in the world.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
absolutely.
there are about like 4,500 ultra high net worth individuals in
Mm.
Singapore.
Hmm.
And one interesting thing to note is that in 2020, so like just before COVID, there were only 400 single family offices in Singapore. And at the end of last year, it grew to 1,500.
Wow, that's
Yeah, so in the span of like 2 to 3 years, there was like such a huge growth in people setting up family offices in Singapore.
mm.
And the minimum requirement for assets invested into Singapore to start a family office is at least 40 million USD. So
Wow.
that it's not a small amount.
Mm.
But yeah, I have noticed like an influx of wealthy people moving to Singapore from all over the world, like you said, the UK, the US, India, Hong Kong, and especially mainland China.
Hmm.
And I think this is also partially due to what happened in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Yeah, but also I think a lot of families with young children who kind of want a good mix of like English. They want the kids to be able to speak English, but also kind of grow up in an Asian culture.
Hmm.
Kind of and looking for higher quality life for the young families. And they often come from high income professions such as finance, consulting, oil, gas. Yeah, and actually a lot of these new imports are actually quite very dynamic, enthusiastic people in their 30s, 40s, or 50s, and a lot of them also are already art patrons or they buy art. Maybe not necessarily collectors, but they have a keen interest in art.
Hmm. So the infrastructure is already there for what
Mhm.
might make this place very attractive for international art markets. And I guess the
Yeah.
Singapore Art Week is an event which happens in late January. Maybe one of the things you could talk about is, I think it's in its second year, the Singapore Art Week, is that right? Or the
Singapore
art
Art Week. Yeah, Singapore Art Week, we are in our 12th year of
in the
Singapore Art
12th year.
Week, but
Yeah,
yeah, but
but
just the
the art
second year for the new fair called
for
Art
the
is
for the art.
G.
Sorry, say that again. For the new fair called
It's called Art is G.
RSG, yeah. Just for the art fair, I'm mixing it up, is in its second year, but Singapore Art Week has been going for
12
12
years.
years. Yeah, and that's interesting. And as I understand it, it's a little bit like the art fair is part of a more general cultural celebration that includes public museum exhibitions as well as the commercial art fair. So the model is more. I would suggest that the model is less like, say, Frieze in London, where generally speaking, the big auction houses and commercial galleries centre a lot of new exhibitions and sales around the Frieze London Art Week in October. But like Tate and the National Gallery they don't really want anything to do with the commercial art world there. Whereas I understand it, like the model in Torino in Italy, they have this art fair called Artissima, which I've been taking the students to. We haven't been recently, but for about 15 years ago, we started going there. And what attracted me to that was that it's part of a general celebration of modern contemporary art in Torino around the whole place, and there are special exhibitions in the big galleries because of the presence of the art fair. And the art fair itself was much less obviously commercial than some art fairs. So it sounds am I right in saying that the Singapore Art Fair has become part of that broader cultural celebratory model?
Yeah, I think I really love the way you describe it, like a celebration of culture and art in Singapore. And I think we're noticing kind of like a trend in the world as well, where I think a lot of people no longer want to travel just for an art fair, but more of an art week. So, whatever is happening in that city, because especially during Singapore Art Week, it was almost like a reunion. Meeting friends, collectors, or industry professionals from, not just Southeast Asia, but Hong Kong, China, and even some flying in from the US and Europe, because everyone's like, so interested about what's happening in Singapore. So I think it's really about like the whole art ecosystem, and especially institutions working together. Yeah, so although like, Singapore doesn't really like our institutions to be in any way commercial or related to the art market, but we did have like the National Gallery and the Singapore Art Museum kind of collaborating on parties and events. Yeah, so I think that made a really big difference, and it made it feel more of like a whole country celebration.
And Singapore Art Fair is a very new art fair, a new kid on the block, as it were. I remember reading reports after the first edition that there were a couple of the big international, Western commercial galleries showed that first year, but were disappointed. I think that that would mean that they're probably not acquiring many new potential collectors. B, they're not having big sales because they aren't back this year. And I think the number of stands has gone down something like by about a third. So do you know what the reasons were for making it a slightly smaller fair? And, how might does it matter to Singaporeans that the big international galleries like Western galleries, for example, aren't there this year? Does that really matter if is it a local celebration, or do you think the intention is to attract people coming in from all over the world, not just for the experience of the art, but also to buy art?
Yeah, I think the fair is really targeting Southeast Asia. So it's meant to be a regional fair.
Yeah.
In terms of the galleries coming back, I don't think the collectors or visitors care which galleries are there. But more of like last year, I think it was the first time that RSG was happening, so it was more of like an experiment. Yeah, and I think it was, also figuring out, what kind of collectors are there, what different tastes there are, and also I think perhaps the price point of the artworks, because although there are a lot of wealthy people living in Singapore, not many of them are art collectors. which means that, maybe they don't have the habit of spending large amounts on artwork.
So the good thing about the Singapore Art Week, which includes a commercial art fair as part of the package, as it were, presumably the hope is that you're also educating local people who might want to start collecting art and eventually high-end art. You're presumably educating them to see that this is actually a worthy thing to visit and to socialize in and to be seen socializing in. And eventually to become collectors themselves. But I guess it sounds as though it's a kind of educational project as well.
Yeah, I think because Singapore is such a new country to art collecting,
Mm-hmm.
I think the art education is really important.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, it takes time.
Mm-hmm.
I would say at least another 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think, when galleries or people come to Singapore, maybe the expectations have to be managed as well.
Absolutely. And of course, that's something we've already touched upon is, and that the world looking at the Singapore art scene is very interested in. There's definitely, I think there's definitely a positive feeling that Singapore could become now, since what's happened in Hong Kong, which is also a free port, of course. But Singapore, because of the politics of Hong Kong at the moment, it could become the new go-to hub for the international art world and art market in Southeast Asia. Would that be a hope, do you think, of some Singaporeans?
Well, I think Singapore is already a hub for Southeast Asia.
Sure.
I mean, Hong Kong has the advantage because the whole country is a free port, and it's so close to mainland China, and that's the advantage of Hong Kong. And if you see, all the major auction houses, they still have the Asia headquarters in Hong Kong,
Yeah.
and they're actually expanding. Whereas we don't really have that in Singapore.
Sure.
We have maybe a small office with 4 or 5 people for the auction houses.
Mm-hmm.
And then we don't have any blue chip galleries in Singapore as well.
And the politics of Hong Kong, that isn't going to particularly affect the working of the art world, and particularly the commercial art world in Hong Kong, what has happened politically recently. So maybe it's a false expectation that that world will move out of Hong Kong into Singapore.
Yeah, I mean, I think they are two completely different cities. Like, Hong Kong has their advantages, Singapore has their advantages. So I think, and even Taipei as well. So I think the three of them, they really go hand in hand, and I don't think there's really much competition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we forget, that we forget that all of these nations that we've mentioned, and now Taiwan and Taipei, the city in Taiwan, that they all have really, really vibrant contemporary art scenes that people don't quite often. All we hear about usually is the political news, and we don't often hear about what's happening in places like Taiwan or Singapore. And when these things do happen, like the Singapore Art Week, it is a big event, and people are very interested in it. The art newspaper's very interested in it, just to see how it's going to go and how it might relocate. But I think it's interesting talking to you, Laura, as an insider, in the fact that that the cultural structures are just different from those that we might expect in, say, London or New York anyway. And it's rather I mean, I apologize, because I can actually feel myself through this whole conversation coming across maybe as a bit patronizing and a kind of Western guy and so on, and I'm kind of very aware of that. I'm not meaning to be patronizing. It's just I'm sincerely interested in the workings of that art world in Singapore, having experienced it earlier in the millennium. And I think it's wonderful that it does sound as though that's growing. I mean, maybe we could finish by you're now, I think, in Brussels. You're traveling at the moment for other work that you're involved in. You did experience the Singapore Art Week and SG.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your own personal subjective experiences?
Yeah, and actually I wanted to bring up an interesting point that wasn't really covered, that wasn't talked about so much in all the art media covering Singapore Art Week. Is that one very interesting aspect is the foreign-based collector involvement compared to the local collectors.
Mhm.
So this year we saw several initiatives from private individuals, such as collector shows, patron-funded shows, or even opening up their homes to visitors.
Mhm.
But all from foreign collectors based in Singapore, and only one show from local collectors.
Mhm.
And you know, perhaps this is due to our culture. You know, Singaporeans, I think we value privacy quite a lot, and we don't really open our home to strangers.
Mhm.
Whereas like I feel like a lot of the energy and vibrancy is actually coming from the foreigners living in Singapore. So for example, we had Pierre Laurenet, he's a French collector, patron. He had a show of his personal collection in Gillman Barracks for the second year in a row. Andreas Till, he's a Malaysian businessman, and he founded a nonprofit called the Institutum, which organized this huge show. You know, they brought in over 100 works from private collections all around Asia, and it was curated by Zoe Whitley from Chisenhale Gallery in London. So that was really, I think, the highlight of Gillman Barracks. Alan and Yen Lo, this Hong Kong couple from Hong Kong who are now splitting the time between Hong Kong and Singapore. So they funded a show, just a dual artist show in an external location. And also two very well-known foreign collectors based in Singapore, Lou Sampson from the Philippines and Jim Anderson from Minneapolis, who, you know, every year they open their homes to young collectors or visitors or industry professionals. And I think this year from Singaporeans, we didn't really see many initiatives except for one group show by 15 Singaporean collectors, which actually came out very organically from like a WhatsApp group. So I think it was a really rare occurrence, but also quite, I think, also a time of, I think, like better things to come.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So again, it sounds, I mean, that's another thing that differs from the Western model is I remember when I was out there that students from Indonesia and Malaysia, for example, that the way that you see contemporary art in particular is you visit people's private homes, and that although that does exist in places like London, it doesn't become part of like a celebration of art in London, that a lot of people open their homes so that members of the public can just go in and walk around. That just doesn't happen. So that I think is something that is actually inherent in the structures of the art world in Southeast Asia and Singapore itself.
Yeah.
And it's quite nice, you know, it's really, really nice, I think, that people open their homes up in that way. And in a sense, I guess that is them being philanthropic, you know, at the same time, I guess, positioning themselves socially in a world of art collectors. And, you know, maybe people who haven't got those kind of collections yet might be visiting those homes and thinking, I've got money, I can create a collection like this. So I guess that may be the way that market develops within Singapore.
Yeah, and I think you know, a lot of it is about, you know, encouragement and inspiration and education
Yeah.
For local people as well.
And in Singapore, I remember hearing that, I don't know if it's changed, probably not. I remember hearing that the education of children, you know, particularly up until degree level, is very strict. You know, they still have, as I understand it, they still have corporal punishment, and you know, which I had when I was at school, but certainly no one in the UK now. You're not allowed to use corporal punishment on anyone. So it's very strict, and I think maybe a lot of people are coming into Singapore because it gives their children a very good education, albeit the negative side of that being the strictness. But as I understand it, they're very well educated, and to compete with the increasingly competitive world of educated people, if you like. And do they teach the history of art in the schools? Do you know?
In pre-tertiary institutions, when I was in school in Singapore, so maybe about 15 years ago, they didn't teach art history. So we had like practical art classes. But we didn't know there was no history of art classes. But
And
I believe that is changing.
yeah, I mean that's quite a norm with we have increasing numbers of Southeast Asian, particularly Chinese students at the moment studying the MA Art business, and they just they don't seem to, they have to come to the West to do traditional art history courses, but of course art history is a Western discipline and it's biased, it's very sort of pro the Western development. So what I would hope for in the future in terms of education in Southeast Asia is that you start teaching courses which are about the history, that you develop the history of like Southeast Asian art as a discipline in its own right, and not just look up to, if you like, the Western models of art history. Does that kind of make sense? No?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, because otherwise there's no pride, there's no cultural pride in your own artistic tradition, which would be a shame, you know. No, that's interesting to know actually. But of course, in this country, the teaching of art history sadly is also disappearing, other than in kind of like fee-paying schools. Particularly, it's very gender inverse. So particularly girls' schools, it's very hard for boys to, not that many boys' schools, single-sex boys' schools in the UK offer art history because it's still seen as a rather feminine, soft subject, which is a shame. So there's all sorts of interesting dynamics, I think, in the teaching of art history. Laura, can you say something about, did you have anything else to say about your experience at the Singapore Art Week?
Yeah, I wanted to maybe highlight one other interesting aspect about Singapore, and which you don't really see in the West, is that another thing that we are lacking maybe is the art criticism. Yeah, because like most of the newspapers in Singapore are government owned.
Yeah.
And so it's very difficult for like arts journalists who write for these publications to have an impartial view. They can't. I've known either freelance journalists who cover different sections of the arts who were asked to leave because they were being too critical.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Or either that, or the local journalists, they don't have a good knowledge of the arts.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even for myself, yeah, I do have to rely on my own research and reading international art media like Art Review for more analytical judgment of important art shows or events.
Yeah, and it can be almost the opposite in like the UK, i.e. critics can be really damning and destroy people's careers, often unnecessarily and unfairly, so it works both ways, that kind of, but I get where you're coming from. If you haven't got honest, objective, academically informed, peer-reviewed art criticism, then how can you expect collectors and consumers of art in a nation to understand what is interesting and what isn't interesting, or what is hot and what is not, what is good and what is not so good? I can understand. Yeah.
And I think also very often in online and print media, because advertising is a huge source of income for these publications. But in local publications, we can't tell which ones are sponsored or which ones are paid for.
Interesting. And then moving to the education, a little bit back to that educational idea. Do you want to tell the listeners something about your own publications and your publishing company and how that might be feeding into that educational idea?
Yeah, so Cinnamon Art Publishing it was founded during COVID when I moved back to Singapore from Hong Kong, and it's my passion project. So it's just been like a dream, just working on these publications. So we specialize in illustrated nonfiction books for children, and we do very niche topics like art, culture, sustainability, technology. So we actually started out with a collection of 6 art books, which are like introductory books to the lives of different artists. And the most recent that we just published is about a late Filipino artist called Pasita Abad. And she's in the middle of a retrospective in North America right now. So she wasn't very well known outside of the Philippines until the retrospective. And we're just so happy that the response has been really positive. And especially since, Southeast Asia is becoming quite an interest like the region of Southeast Asia in the world. And also because like people in the West, they consider Asians like people of color. Yeah, so I think it's been quite well received so far.
Very
Yeah, so I think we hope to continue publishing more books on Southeast Asian artists.
That's fantastic, because I think some of the early ones were, if I remember rightly, were Western artists, were they?
Yeah, like a mix of Western and Asian.
Yeah, a male and
Yeah.
female,
Male and female, yes.
which is great. So, and these are for children. They're I've seen them. They're really lovely, touching books that, you know, I wish that I'd been able to give my son when he was little, growing up. And you know, maybe we don't. I have seen similar. I think there are similar publications you might be aware of, that not aren't your publishing company. Maybe people have jumped on that bandwagon. I don't know. You do see kids' books about individual artists. Like, you didn't do Frida Kahlo, did you?
No, I didn't
Yeah, I
want to
think
do
I've
an
seen one on
artist.
Frida Kahlo.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there. Anyway, Laura, thank you. You know, there's obviously a lot more to learn about that Singaporean art scene, and you know, it was still in the middle of Singapore Art Week, and it'd be very interesting to see how the Western press, you know, views whether it's successful or not this year. But I think what I've learned from it, and I think the listeners will have learned from this, is that maybe we're looking at it through the wrong lens. From the Western viewpoint, everything has to be successful. We have to see the presence of the big, you know, 2 or 3 of the big international Western-based commercial dealers there. And it doesn't sound to me at the moment as though that's what it's about. It sounds to me as though the Singaporeans are, on one level, very smartly, the people involved in the art scene anyway, are very, very organically trying to grow this interest in the art of Southeast Asia in particular, and to celebrate it. And I think, you know, that is wonderful that it becomes part of a local celebration, rather than just oh, let's show off how wealthy I am and go and be seen buying art and take selfies of myself with it. It sounds as though it's a bit more than that. It's a bit more of a cultural celebration.
Yeah, I think a cultural celebration and you know, also a big social event and meeting point
Yeah.
For collectors and visitors.
I think we have a lot to learn. We still have this thorny symbiosis, I would say, between the academic public sector and the commercial art world. You know, our orthodox art history university departments are still, most of the academics are often openly anti-market. You know, don't ever talk about the value of a work of art when you're studying art history. And I think that, you know, so they wouldn't, you know, therefore Tate Modern and Tate Britain and the National Gallery in London, for example, the British Museum, would not want to get involved with collateral events, we might call them, when Frieze Art Fair is on. Whereas it sounds to me as though we're missing a trick there. It's a real shame that we're seeing somehow that commercial art world is somehow divorced from the collections, which are of course all based on the fact that there have been the Charles Sarges of the world and people prepared to be philanthropists and buy the work of emerging artists and take a risk on them, which of course public galleries can't do. They can't take financial risks in an emerging artist in case they don't end up being very well known. So it's a kind of, I think we have a lot to learn from those models, you know, that are developing in Singapore. So I'd like to thank you very much, Laura, on behalf of all the listeners and myself and my students, for sharing those very, very interesting ideas, and letting us know, giving us knowledge and enlightening us on what's been happening in Singapore, particularly during the current Singapore Art Week. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure, you know, being able to talk about Singapore and Singapore Art Week.
Thank you, Laura.